For decades, the Middle East revolved around one central gravity: Iran's reach, Iran's defiance, Iran's shadow. Now that gravity is weakening, and whenever power fades, something else rushes in to replace it. Today, that force is Saudi Arabia, not the cautious kingdom of the past, but a far more assertive state shaped by one man, Mohammed bin Salman. His Saudi Arabia is recalibrating alliances, reopening old rivalries, and quietly asking a dangerous question: what if the United States is no longer the only pillar to lean on? This is not about ideology. It is about leverage, about memory, about what happens when a long-standing security bargain begins to feel one-sided. If you want to understand where the Middle East is heading next, you have to understand why Riyadh believes the old rules no longer apply. Stay with me, because this story is not just about Saudi Arabia. It is about the future balance of power itself. And it begins with the rivalry that has shaped the region for nearly half a century. To see why this moment matters, we first need to define the problem Saudi Arabia believes it is trying to solve. At the heart of this moment is a simple but uncomfortable tension. Saudi Arabia's growing regional influence no longer moves in perfect alignment with Washington's expectations. For decades, the US-Saudi relationship rested on a clear exchange: security guarantees from Washington, strategic cooperation from Riyadh. Iran was the shared threat. Stability was the shared goal. But that clarity has begun to blur. From Yemen to Ankara, Saudi Arabia is no longer reacting. It is initiating. It is recalibrating ties with former rivals, exploring new defense arrangements, and signaling that its foreign policy will be shaped first by Saudi interests, not by automatic deference to any external power. To some in Washington, this looks like drift. To others, it looks like hedging. To Riyadh, it is a response to accumulated lessons, moments when threats were ignored, sacrifices were questioned, and loyalty felt conditional. The real question is not whether Saudi Arabia is changing. It is whether the old framework was ever sustainable once Iran began to weaken. To understand why this recalibration feels inevitable to Riyadh, we need to step back into history, rivalry, and the long shadow cast by 1979. Since Iran's 1979 revolution, the Middle East has been shaped by a quiet but relentless competition between two visions of power. Saudi Arabia and Iran did not merely contest territory, they contested influence, legitimacy, and leadership across the broader Muslim world. For decades, Saudi policy was cautious, consensus-driven, and deeply tied to American security guarantees. Iran, by contrast, built power asymmetrically through proxies, militias, and ideological networks that allowed it to expand influence without direct confrontation. Mohammed bin Salman's rise marked a break from that inherited caution. His consolidation of authority inside the kingdom coincided with a regional landscape already in motion. Iran's network had stretched from Lebanon to Yemen, but it was also becoming overextended, vulnerable to sanctions, internal pressure, and strategic pushback. As Iran's momentum slowed, a familiar pattern emerged in geopolitics. When a dominant challenger weakens, the balance does not stabilize, it destabilizes. The question becomes who moves first and who hesitates. Saudi Arabia chose not to hesitate. That choice would soon collide with a crisis that exposed the deepest fault lines in the US-Saudi relationship. The breaking point did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It arrived drone by drone, rocket by rocket. For years, Iran-backed Houthi forces launched hundreds of attacks into Saudi territory: airports, oil infrastructure, civilian areas. The message was unmistakable. Saudi Arabia was under direct fire, not in theory but in practice. From Riyadh's perspective, the response from Washington felt painfully muted. Administrations changed, rhetoric shifted, but the core frustration remained. The threat was real, the cost was real. And yet, Saudi leaders felt the urgency was not fully shared. Then came a decision that many in Riyadh interpreted as a signal rather than a policy detail: the removal of the Houthis' terror designation by the Biden administration. To critics inside Saudi Arabia, this was not just a bureaucratic adjustment. It was a message about priorities and about whose security concerns carried weight. This moment forced a recalculation. If backing was conditional, then dependence was dangerous. If you are trying to understand why Saudi Arabia began looking outward to new partners and new leverage, this is where the mental shift occurred. And once that shift happened, it unlocked a deeper, more consequential question about how Saudi Arabia would protect itself in a changing world. What followed was not a rupture, but a redesign. Saudi Arabia did not abandon the United States. Instead, it built redundancy into its strategy. This is the hidden mechanism behind Riyadh's recent moves, not ideological realignment, but risk management. When Mohammed bin Salman explored outreach to Russia and China, it was less about choosing new patrons and more about signaling optionality, a way of saying Saudi security would no longer rely on a single external guarantee. Not after Yemen, not after the Houthis. At the same time, Riyadh began reducing friction across the region. The logic was simple: endless rivalry drains power, de-escalation preserves it. Engagement with Turkey, including quiet discussions around defense arrangements, reflected this shift. Rivals were no longer permanent, interests were. This approach reframed Saudi foreign policy around stability, development, and flexibility, rather than ideological camps. It also allowed Riyadh to move faster than the traditional consensus-driven Gulf model. But systems built for flexibility carry a cost. When interests diverge, even allies can collide. That collision would soon emerge, not with Iran, but with a partner once considered indispensable. That collision surfaced most clearly in Yemen, the war that was meant to contain Iran, but instead exposed competing visions of order. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates entered the conflict as partners, united by a shared objective: roll back Iranian influence through the Houthis. But over time, unity gave way to divergence. Riyadh prioritized a unified Yemeni state, believing fragmentation would only open more doors for Iran. The UAE pursued control, backing southern separatists, securing ports, and shaping security corridors. What had been a single front quietly split into parallel campaigns. Then, in recent days, the tension erupted. Saudi and Yemeni government forces moved decisively, retaking large parts of southern and eastern Yemen from the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council. The STC's leadership reportedly fled. The group itself appeared to unravel. For Saudi Arabia, this was about restoring coherence. For critics, it was a warning sign, evidence that Riyadh was now willing to confront even close partners when interests diverged. Yemen was no longer just a proxy battlefield. It had become a mirror, reflecting the risks of Saudi Arabia's new assertiveness. But the most profound consequences of this shift are not measured on maps or battlefields. They are felt by ordinary people. When strategies shift at the top, it is people on the ground who absorb the shock. If you are a Yemeni civilian, these power struggles are not abstract debates about alliances. They are checkpoints, shortages, uncertainty about who controls your city next week. Fragmentation does not just weaken states, it fractures daily life. And if you are a Saudi citizen, the calculation feels just as personal. You are watching your country take on greater risk in exchange for greater autonomy. More independence, yes, but also more responsibility. When alliances blur, protection becomes something you must actively secure, not assume. This is why accusations and counter-accusations matter. Claims that Saudi Arabia is empowering Islamist factions provoke fear not because ideology dominates policy, but because history teaches what blowback looks like when armed movements escape control. At the same time, Saudi officials insist this is about stability, not ideology, about preventing Yemen from becoming permanently divided and permanently exploitable. If this debate feels uncomfortable, it should, because it forces a question onto everyone watching: how much instability is the price of independence? And beyond Yemen, the ripple effects of this recalibration are already crossing borders. Saudi Arabia's recalibration does not stay contained within the Middle East. It reshapes the geometry of global power. When Riyadh signals that it has options beyond Washington, other capitals take notice. Ankara moves quickly, exploring deeper defense cooperation. Moscow and Beijing read the message carefully, not as an invitation, but as leverage. The United States, meanwhile, faces a quieter challenge: influence that must now be negotiated, not assumed. This shift matters because Saudi Arabia sits at the intersection of energy markets, regional security, and religious legitimacy. Its choices reverberate far beyond its borders. A more independent Riyadh means a more fluid regional order, one less anchored to a single external guarantor. For allies, this introduces uncertainty. For rivals, opportunity. For global markets, volatility. And for Washington, it raises a fundamental strategic dilemma: how to manage partnerships in a world where loyalty is no longer binary and alignment is no longer permanent. The era when Middle Eastern politics could be organized around one dominant axis is fading. What comes next depends on how this experiment in autonomy unfolds and whether it stabilizes the region or destabilizes it further. From this moment forward, Saudi Arabia's path can unfold in three very different ways. The first is a stabilizing scenario. Riyadh's assertiveness succeeds in reducing proxy conflict, deterring Iran's remnants, and encouraging pragmatic diplomacy. Saudi autonomy becomes a pillar of regional order, not a threat to it. The United States adjusts, not retreats, accepting a partner that is more independent, but still aligned on fundamentals. The second is a mixed outcome. Saudi Arabia gains flexibility, but at the cost of persistent friction. Alliances become transactional, coordination weakens. Stability holds, but only barely sustained by constant recalibration rather than shared vision. Power vacuums shrink, then reopen. The third scenario is darker. Miscalculations accumulate. Fragmentation deepens. Rivalries harden rather than dissolve. Armed actors outgrow their sponsors. In this version of the future, autonomy becomes isolation and influence breeds blowback. Which path emerges will not be decided by rhetoric or summits. It will be decided by systems. How interests are balanced, how partners are reassured, and how restraint is enforced when power tempts excess. History shows that rising autonomy is never neutral. It either strengthens order or rewrites it. And that brings us to the final question, not about Saudi Arabia alone, but about the future of the partnership that shaped the region for decades. This moment in the Middle East is not defined by Iran's weakness alone. It is defined by what fills the space it leaves behind. Mohammed bin Salman is not dismantling the old order out of defiance. He is testing whether it still works, whether a system built on assumptions from another era can survive in a world where guarantees feel conditional and power must be actively managed. For Washington, this is the real challenge. Not whether Saudi Arabia is drifting away, but whether the United States is prepared to engage partners who no longer accept dependency as the price of stability. For the region, the stakes are higher. Autonomy can produce balance. It can also produce fragmentation. The difference lies in restraint, clarity, and trust, all of which are harder to maintain in a multipolar world. If you want to understand the future of Middle Eastern power, don't watch declarations. Watch behavior. Watch who hedges, who adapts, and who assumes yesterday's rules still apply. If this analysis helped you see the region more clearly, share it. These shifts are quiet, but their consequences won't be. And in the next video, we'll examine what happens when power vacuums are filled not by states, but by systems that refuse to be controlled.